All right, so let's start with part one. Um, Basically, creating a foreground system with an original process where you build out the inputs and outputs from scratch. So we're just going to look at one process where the inputs are coming directly from the Euclid database. So we're going to create a process for producing a plastic bottle with uh, simply three inputs, as you see here: electricity, PET, and transport requirements. And the outputs will be the bottle itself, the waste of PET, and two emissions. Okay, so let's turn over to openLCA. So let's open our equipment database that we want to work from. So here's where the equipment 3.4 database is, and as you're aware of, all of these processes represent all these folders have equivalent processes categorized by sector. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't recommend changing any of these processes. You have the freedom to do so, but you shouldn't, because that will, ultimately change the background database. So whenever you want to use a process and modify it, simply copy it and create a new one. And I'll show you that in part two. But let's start with part one. So the first thing is we want to create a bottle. And so the product flow is a bottle itself. Now we could search to see under flows whether such a product flow already exists. So I type in bottle, and all we see is PET for a bottle. Therefore, the product flow being a bottle actually doesn't exist in the equipment database right now. So we're going to have to create it. So we go to flows, and I've created a folder called my flows. I put an underscore so that it shows up at the top. But you can create your own folder by just right clicking and selecting add new child category. Okay, so I have the folder here where I'm going to put my flows that I created, and I'm going to just right click it and then click on new flow. So I'm going to call this just going to keep it specific to this example. Let's call it test bottle. And then the flow type is essentially it's either going to be an elementary flow, a product, or a waste. So we know it's a product. An elementary flow would be basically something from or to nature. So from nature being a resource like, say, iron ore that you mine from the ground, or to nature being basically any emission to air, water, or soil. And waste is simply a waste flow from a transforming process generally. So we're going to focus on a product, and the reference flow property is essentially the functional unit of that product. And so since it's a bottle, it's not a metric unit, but we're just looking for this number of items because it can be quantified in terms of number of items, and we're interested in one bottle or one item. So we're going to select number of items and then go finish. Okay, so now we have our product flow up and running. That will allow us to create a process. So likewise with flows, I can create my own folder, which I call my processes, and I can right click on that folder and say new process. And so this is going to be a new process for this test bottle that we're creating. I call it test bottle production. Okay, and we have to select a quantitative reference. So while we just created it, it's in my flows, so I'm just going to select it. Otherwise, you can always search for it here, but since I know it's here, I'm just going to select it there. And otherwise, you could also create a new flow for the process right away, so that would sort of skip the step of needing to create it first in the flows, to save a bit of time. But anyway, let's go on. So I press finish. So now I have the process created called test bottle production. Now I can fill in a few fields. I can add description of what the process represents. This is its unique identifier. This is the time validity of the process. So sort of what the technology is valid for in the timeline. So you could specify that. You could specify the geography. Why don't we do that right now? So I'm just going to assume it's in Canada and the province I'm in, Ontario. And then you could describe the technology and the data quality schema. Let's assume we're going to use Eco Invent Data Quality System. And for the flow schema, again, let's assume Eco Invent Data. So this is to do with performing Monte Carlo simulation. Okay, so that's good enough for the scope of this lesson. Let's focus on adding the inputs and outputs. So let's go back and look at what the inputs are again. So we have electricity, PET, I'm going to copy this right now, and transport 200 kilometers, which equates to 0.02 ton kilometers. Okay. So let's start by adding our first input. So I go add input, and I want electricity, and we can find the correct category: electricity, gas, steam, and air conditioning supply. Just punch down into it: electric power generation transmission, and let's assume a medium voltage. So I go into the options, and so I'm interested in medium voltage, so I'm going to select this one and go OK. And we know if we go back and look, we see 0.02 kilowatt hours. So I'm going to change the unit from megajoules to kilowatt hours, and 0.02 per bottle. And the provider we can select as being the one, the grid mix for the region, which is this one right here with the country code Canada and Ontario. And there we go. So now we can add the polyethylene, the PET. So we see we have it here. We can assume recycled or bottle grade. Let's assume the bottle grade one here. So I select that, and we need 0.1 kilograms. Okay, we can look at the provider just to see what regions are available. Since we're in Ontario, let's select the closest region to us, and the closest region we have is Quebec. So let's go with Quebec then. And then the last one is transportation. So I'm going to add another process input, and that's going to be transport. So I just type in transport to filter it, and we have this category for transportation and storage, and it's going to be land transportation, and it's not by railway or pipeline. There's other transport, and we want freight transport by road. And let's assume like a medium duty truck. This one should be suitable, so let's go with that. And as we saw earlier, we need 0.02 tons kilometers. And again, we can look for a more specific provider. Why don't we go with rest of world? We don't have a specific consumption, specific process for the region, so let's just go with the rest of world process. Okay, there we go. So now we have our inputs. Let's go back to look at what our outputs are. So we have the bottle itself, which is already there as a reference flow, and then we have some waste production, which is actually PET. So let's be sure to include that, and then we have these emissions here. I'm just going to copy and paste this. It's easier, and then CO2 as well. 2.5 milligrams and 0.09 kilograms of CO2. Okay, so let's add the waste, polyethylene, and you see it coming up here, waste polyethylene terephthalate. So I'm going to select that, and now I'm going to update it with the value we have, which is 0.03 kilograms. So I go 0.03, and then I'm going to add the two air emissions that we're assuming. Let's assume the factory, the manufacturing plant is in a low density population. So I'm going to type in the first emission, which is here. So let's look at low population density as where it's being emitted from. And we're going to change this to 2.5 milligrams. So look up the mass for milligrams right here, mg. And lastly, we're going to add carbon dioxide, and we're assuming it's from a fossil fuel source. So I type in carbon dioxide, and here we go. We don't want high population, not that it matters so much, but for CO2 anyway. And we're going to go with fossil. There we go. So we have everything set up. Just have to change that to the actual value, 0.9. And there we go. So we have the input set up. We can save this, Control S. And now we can go to the next step of creating a product system that will allow us to actually calculate the results for it. So I can press this create product system. And yeah, the reference process is selected already. and we can prefer default providers or ignore default. Let's just keep it as is, keep this as is, or we can go unit process. It doesn't matter so much since the database is basically all unit processes for econvent. And we can go finish. So this is basically setting up the product system that will allow for the LCA calculations of our reference flow. Okay, so it's all set up, and now you can look in the product systems, and now it shows up, test bottle production, and we can calculate it, the results. But that'll be for a later step. So that's pretty much concludes this first lesson, part 1.